The White House this afternoon attempting to defend how it handled the U.S. troop withdrawal from Afghanistan as the Taliban solidifies its grip on that country, and Americans and allies rush to try to safely evacuate. This afternoon, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said that the Taliban has agreed to give civilians safe passage to the Kabul airport, where the U.S. military is hoping to speed up the pace of evacuation flights within the next 24 hours. This striking image, obtained by Defense One, shows nearly 650 Afghans packed inside a U.S. military cargo plane. They were safely evacuated on Sunday to Qatar. The White House estimates that at least 11,000 Americans remain in Afghanistan. But those figures do not include the tens of thousands of Afghan allies who helped the U.S. during the war, and their families, who could be killed by the Taliban if they are not promptly flown out of the country. Let's begin our coverage today with CNN's Clarissa Ward, who's live in the Afghan capital of Kabul. And Clarissa, you're getting a sense of just how quickly life is changing for ordinary Afghan citizens who are once again under the cruel rule of the Taliban.
That's right, Jake. I mean, there's the sense, I guess, that this is the new normalcy, and there are signs of normalcy creeping back onto the streets. The Taliban announced that government workers should be returning to their posts. Today, we saw traffic policemen on the roads guiding traffic. As I've mentioned before, the Taliban really wants to show that it can effectively govern, that it is not just a fighting force. But walking around the streets, Jake, it was impossible to ignore that women were not as visible. And we went out looking for those women to hear their stories. Take a listen.
At the central Kabul market today, stores were open and people were back on the streets. Or at least some people. It was impossible not to notice that women here seem to have largely melted away. One store was doing better business than usual. For more than a decade, Mohammed has been selling burqas, the head-to-toe covering once imposed by the Taliban. Business was good, but now it's even better, he tells us. More sales.
Why do you think you're selling more burqas right now?
Because the Taliban took over and all the women are afraid, he says. So that's why they're all coming in and buying burqas.
Do you feel abandoned?
Yeah, exactly.
In an apartment downtown, we saw that fear firsthand. Until last week, Fazila was working for the UN. That's not her real name, and she asks we not show her face. She's petrified that the Taliban will link her to Western organizations and says she hasn't gone outside since they arrived in Kabul.
You look very frightened.
Exactly. Too much stress. It is not easy for a person to work a lot with international organization, having more than 10 years experience of working with international, and now no one of them helped me. Just sending emails to different organizations that I work with you, but now no response.
Are you angry?
No, I'm not angry, but as a person who work with them, now I need their supports. It is not fair.
You look very emotional as well.
Yeah, because I'm thinking about my future, my daughters. What will happen to them if they kill me, 2 daughters without mother?
The Taliban says they have learned from history and that women's rights will be protected. But many fearful Afghan women remain to be persuaded.
We're on our way now to the home of a prominent female Afghan politician. She's told me that there are Taliban fighters outside her front door, so she's asked that I go in alone.
Kofi was one of the Afghan government negotiators during peace talks with the Taliban and has dealt with the group a lot. She says that promising change is not enough.
They have to really prove it in the provinces across Afghanistan. They have to show it by example. It's very easy to issue statements, but people need to see that in practice.
Kofi has every reason not to trust. Last year, she was shot by unknown gunmen. The Taliban denied they were behind the attack.
You have children?
I have 2 daughters.
And are they here?
They are in Kabul.
And are you concerned for them, or?
I'm concerned for my daughters and all the girls of Afghanistan. I don't want history to repeat itself on them very brutally.
Jake, we heard for the first time in person from the Taliban spokesperson, Zabiullah Mujahid. He gave a press conference tonight, and it was really interesting to see the types of questions that were asked by Afghan journalists particularly. It really goes to show you how much has changed here in 2 generations, or 2 decades, I should say. These journalists were not pulling any punches. They pushed him on women's rights. They pushed him on whether women would be able to continue working as journalists, continue working on television. And he was sort of struggling to answer and give a direct and coherent response. But the one question that really just stuck with me, it was so extraordinary. He was talking about this blanket amnesty that the Taliban has granted to everyone. And this journalist stood up and says, "But will the Afghan people forgive you for all the people, the innocent civilians who've been killed in your car bombs?" To which Mujahid replied, "Well, that's collateral damage. It happens." But the courage of that journalist to ask that question, to look him squarely in the eye and ask that, I think it speaks to the real changes that have happened here in the last 20 years, Jake. And whether the Taliban has changed or not, the people here certainly have.
Right, the existence of social media, a whole generation of girls, women, and boys and men educated in the last 20 years. Clarissa, what was the mood like when you were walking around Kabul earlier today?
It's a very strange mood because it looks normal. It feels secure. There isn't that same, as a journalist even, there's not the same fear that at any moment you could be kidnapped or shot or blown up. And that's partially because the people who might have done that to you before are now the people who are in charge of the place. But the market was open. It was bustling. I would say about a third of the stores, if not half of the stores, were open. And traffic was moving. This is this moment. The Taliban knows they have to get it right. They know that they have to get things moving along again, that if there's any vacuum or any kind of violent crackdown of any sort or chaos, that they will lose the momentum that they have on their side. They're keen to show now that they're benevolent, as well as being able to provide law and order. But you heard it from those women, and particularly from Fawzia Kufa, an extraordinarily brave politician. The proof will be in the pudding. And it's not what you say, it's what you do.
Right, and we've seen the Taliban, as they took over the country, grabbing young girls, forcing them into these, I don't want to call them marriages, but forcing them into these hideous relationships with their fighters. You just mentioned that the Taliban claimed today that they've pledged amnesty to former Afghan forces. They also said there would be, quote, no violence against women. I mean, can anybody trust anything that they have to say?
I think that for the most part, people have a really hard time trusting. And I asked Fawzia Kufa, I said, come on, you've dealt with them, you've been with them, you've negotiated with them. Do you believe what they're saying? And she said, for now, it's hard for me to trust. She doesn't rule it out entirely. But here's the thing, Jake. It's not enough for the Taliban just to say women can be educated. It's about leading by example. And so if the Taliban wants to really show that they have changed in this respect from their fundamental ideology, then they need to actively campaign for women's education, to make it clear to all the people in this country that there is a new direction. Because the other woman, Fazila, as we called her, she told me that her sister went out to buy some milk the other day, and the grocer at the grocery store said to her, you know, you really should be wearing proper hijab, proper covering. He never would have said that 2 weeks ago. But now, because the Taliban is in town, people adopt their posture, they change their behavior to please what they think is the sort of prevailing lord or a ruler at the time. And that's the real problem here. The Taliban can't just say these things in passing. They have to actively show by example that there have been fundamental changes in the way they're going to govern. And I would say from people I have spoken to, not many have a huge amount of faith that that is really going to happen.
Yeah. Clarissa Ward, live in Kabul, Afghanistan. Thank you for your brave reporting, as always. Joining us now to discuss General David Petraeus, the former commander of U.S. and NATO forces in Afghanistan from 2010 to 2011. General, I'd like to know what your reaction has been to what we've seen out of Kabul the last few days.
Well, I think it's hard not to observe that it's just heartbreaking. It's tragic. And whatever you may think of the previous Afghan government, its replacement by a group that has been fighting against us for 20 years, that has killed civilians left and right, that has done all of the things that you described in the rural areas that they have entered prior to getting to Kabul. It's very hard to see that as anything but disastrous. The previous government, again, for all of its shortcomings and flaws, wholeheartedly supported our effort to ensure that al-Qaeda could not reestablish the kind of sanctuary that it enjoyed when it planned the 9/11 attacks on Afghan soil under the control of the Taliban.